Welcome to the town that went to war. Hey guys. Tonight we drift into a place where absurdity lingers like morning fog and municipal chaos once tiptoed dangerously close to full-blown civil war, but with significantly less bloodshed and significantly more paperwork. You're standing on a sleepy dirt road, the kind that curls gently between small clapboard houses with peeling white paint, next to modest picket fences that have seen better decades. Somewhere behind you a dog barks without urgency. The year is sometime in the late 1800s, and you've just arrived in Saginaw, Michigan, except you haven't, really, not fully. You're in East Saginaw, or maybe Saginaw City, or both. Depends on whom you ask. The real kicker, they're the same place. And also, not. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I always read them while sipping sleepy tea. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle along Main Street, or what used to be Main Street before it was renamed 6 times by competing town councils, who couldn't agree on a commemorative tree, let alone a street name. On the left, you pass the Saginaw City Courthouse, a modest red brick affair with ivy crawling up its spine. A few blocks down, still within walking distance, you'll find East Saginaw's equally proud Municipal Hall, which looks suspiciously like a church that was hastily repurposed by people who thought democracy could be built on top of a Sunday schoolroom. Back in the day, settlers arrived on both sides of the Cass River, lumber workers, trappers, traders, and dreamers with questionable dental hygiene but strong opinions about riverbanks. As Michigan boomed with timber money, to rival settlements grew East Saginaw on one side, Saginaw City on the other. But instead of merging like sensible neighbors with shared values and a mutual appreciation for wooden sidewalks, they each decided they were the rightful town, and thus began the most polite, long-winded, and paperwork-heavy war you've never heard of. You wouldn't survive this war not because of danger, but because the sheer volume of council meetings and citizen petitions would crush your soul long before a cannon ever fired. If someone had built a cannon, that is, which they didn't, though one man did try to requisition one from the state militia. That request was politely denied, with a note saying, "Try diplomacy." As you walk past the general store known to both sides as Neutral Goods, you can't help but overhear the rustle of competing town criers. Yes, town criers with bells and everything. One shouts, "Attend the meeting at the real town hall at 6. While the other yells, "Real town hall is on 1st Street, not 3rd, you charlatans." A small child throws a pebble at one of them. It's unclear which side he supports, but he has passion. By 1870, the town had split so thoroughly that even time felt fractured. 2 mayors issued contradictory ordinances, 2 newspapers published contradictory stories, 2 school boards insisted they had the authority to issue diplomas. It's said that one child graduated twice in the same year from the same school, once from Saginaw High and once from East Saginaw Collegiate, which was technically just the same building with a different flag. Both ceremonies had punch and cookies, neither had accurate transcripts. Historically speaking, yes, the feud was real. Saginaw and East Saginaw existed as legally distinct municipalities. Despite being geographically entangled like spaghetti left too long in a colander, the Michigan state government, in its infinite wisdom, tried multiple times to broker a reconciliation. Governors came and went. Surveys were redrawn. At one point, a professional cartographer from Detroit declared the whole situation a political Escher drawing. But here's the fringe twist. According to some local legends and verified but deeply cherished, an early clerical error at the state level had misfiled both town charters into the same drawer, making them legally overlapping yet weirdly autonomous. Kind of like if 2 people accidentally rented the same apartment and just decided to live there simultaneously without ever acknowledging each other. Awkward, but somehow it worked. Of course, scholars still debate what truly fueled the rivalry. Was it economics? East Saginaw had better access to the lumber mills. Was it pride? Each side wanted the glory of being the Saginaw. Or was it the ever-persistent friction of 2 towns named after the same indigenous word for land of the Sauk? The scholarly jury is still out, mainly because they can't agree on whether East Saginaw's refusal to share its railroad profits counted as colonial hubris or just Midwest passive aggression. Your stroll brings you to the riverbank. The Cass River looks serene tonight, its water lazily curling under a wooden bridge that appears stable until you notice a sign hanging from its midpoint. Cross at own risk, jurisdiction subject to mood. A man fishing nearby laughs and says, "That's not a joke." You decide not to cross, just in case. There's something oddly cozy about this place. Its madness is lostic and local, the sort of bureaucratic drama that doesn't end in explosions, just exasperated sighs and very stern letters. It's a war of paperwork, of egos, and of overlapping post offices that occasionally delivered the same letter twice, once with a Saginaw City stamp, and again with East Saginaw. Lucky residents called it mail déjà vu. As twilight falls, you hear a faint piano melody drifting from a saloon, one of the few buildings recognized by both municipalities. Music, it seems, is a bipartisan comfort. You sit on a bench with peeling green paint and look out across the river. Somewhere out there, another version of this town is watching you back. And that's the beauty of this bizarre story. Not about war in the traditional sense. It's about identity, stubbornness, and the curious way humans can split themselves in two even when they're standing in the same place. You lean back, let the cool evening settle in your bones, and prepare to wander deeper into this saga of silly standoffs and lovingly held grudges. The town with too much paperwork. You wake up the next morning in your little rented room above McClary's General Supply, the one establishment, curiously, that neither East Saginaw nor Saginaw City ever tried to claim, probably because old man McClary used to sell pickaxes to both sides during the town's passive-aggressive standoffs, and no one wanted to argue with a man who once invoiced the city council for emotional duress caused by civic nonsense. You stretch your legs. The wooden floorboards creak like they're whispering secrets from 1883, and as you pull aside the faded curtain, the town outside is already alive with the gentle chaos of double governance. Horses trot both east and west. Two milkmen exchange suspicious glances. And you, are brave, semi-conscious observer, descend the stairs just in time to hear someone muttering, "This is the fourth form I've filled out for the same chicken coop." Classic. You wander into the town square, which is your now aware technically isn't a town square. It's two overlapping town squares, each with its own layout plans, landscaping orders, and deeply personal preference for what kind of flower should fill the central urn. One insists on geraniums, the other says daisies or bust. Today they've compromised by doing nothing, so the urn stands empty like a peace offering no one had the courage to fill. This is Saginaw's charm, indecision that somehow ages into tradition. You stop at the records office, or at least the east one. It's a modest clapboard building with a creaky door and the smell of old paper and coffee that's been reheated one too many times. Inside, you find one Miss Adeline Wortherby, senior clerk of East Saginaw's Land Records Division. She's lived here all her life, and her memory is sharper than any file in the cabinet. You looking for a land title, marriage license, or chicken complaint? She asks, not looking up. You tell her you're just trying to understand how one town can have so much paperwork. She finally looks up. "Oh honey," she says, "we got two of everything except common sense." And she's not wrong. In the mid to late 1800s, as both sides of Saginaw began to flourish from the booming lumber industry, every small administrative task required navigating the delicate diplomacy of a divided town. We want to build a house. Submit your request to both councils. Want to marry someone across the river. Fill out a secondary form for intermunicipal unions. Want to sell lumber. Choose your preferred side for taxation. Just know that if you guess wrong, you'll get a fine from the other side for operating without appropriate east-west authorization. This bureaucratic absurdity actually resulted in one of the more famous fringe incidents of the era, the Great Fence Line Audit of 1877. A farmer named Clive Jensen had his property bisected by the municipal boundary line. One year, he paid taxes on the barn to East Saginaw and the cornfield to Saginaw City. When a new tax assessor visited, he claimed Jensen had evaded both by underreporting the silo's footprint. Furious, Jensen built a fence right down the boundary line with a handmade sign reading, "Choose your government, and leave me alone." It became a minor tourist attraction, until someone stole the sign. To this day, no one knows which town confiscated it. One historical truth here: both East Saginaw and Saginaw City were legally incorporated, maintained their own charters, and even submitted separate census reports to the federal government. The 1880 U.S. Census had to send two teams to the same general area, leading to one of the more curious clerical headaches in Michigan's archival history. Scholars still debate whether the dual governance was the result of deliberate political maneuvering. Land developers often preferred East Saginaw's more entrepreneurial councilor, just the natural product of stubborn townfathers who couldn't agree on whose mud was muddier. You head next door to the notary office, where two desks sit across from each other like Cold War diplomats. One is labeled East Business, the other Saginaw City Only. They don't speak, not out of hostility, but because neither clerk wants to be the first to acknowledge the other's desk. A man walks in and asks to have a deed notarized. The East clerk stamps it. The West clerk quietly turns her head and writes invalid on a separate sheet. The man sighs, thanks them both, and walks out shaking his head like someone who's just lost at municipal bingo that was around this time. According to historical rumor, that one exhausted citizen named Maribel Dobson invented a new method of protest paperwork, flooding. She submitted the same complaint to both councils every week for 5 months, once about a squeaky lamppost, once about suspicious squirrels, and once, famously, about the lack of coordination in library cataloging systems. Her goal wasn't to get action, it was to watch them bicker over who had jurisdiction. It worked. The squirrels stayed. The lamppost still squeaks by noon. You're back in the town square now, buzzing with gossip that someone accidentally filed 2 marriage certificates for the same couple but under 2 different last names. The East registrar insists the bride is officially Clarabelle Johnson. The West records show her as Clarabelle Johnstone. The couple, tired of the hassle, legally adopt a new surname. Clarabelle and Henry just callous married. The joke becomes local legend. Some still insist it's true, though no documentation survives, probably lost in a filing cabinet war. And then there's the ever-fascinating debate among local historians. Could the dual-town model have worked long-term? Some say yes, pointing to the economic success of East Saginaw's commercial district and Saginaw City's robust public health system. Others argue the entire structure was an elaborate delaying tactic, allowing elite landowners to avoid taxes by shifting allegiances whenever convenient. The fringe theory, that the entire split was orchestrated by 2 rival newspapers in a marketing stunt. No one's proven it, but considering how much ink was spilled over daisy preferences and parade routes, it's not entirely off the table. You stop for a late lunch at Mabel's Diner, another rare neutral zone. Mabel, a tough Hasnell's widow who once served coffee to both mayors in the same hour, refuses to take sides. Her menus have no logos. Her mugs say simply drink and shut up, and her pie is politically unaffiliated. She tells you a story about a man who once tried to pay for his lunch with 2 different currencies, one minted by each side. He said it was symbolic. She snorts. I told him symbolism didn't cover rhubarb. By evening, the town settles again into its quiet rhythm. You sit outside, watching lamplighters walk the cobbled paths and ignite the soft orange glow of gas lanterns. Somewhere a clerk is still filing a report about a fence violation. Somewhere else, 2 council members are arguing over which side has the better view of the moon. And you, tired, amused, and only slightly baffled, lean back and smile. Because in a world of global conflict, revolutions, and empire building, there's something weirdly soothing about a war made entirely of stamps, squabbles, and duplicate ledgers. You close your eyes and let the soft rustle of paperwork lull you toward dreams. After all, in this town, even dreams have to be submitted in duplicate. When maps start lying to you, you wake up to the sound of rustling paper, not wind through trees, not birdsong but paper. Lots of it. You peer out the window and spot 2 surveyors standing in the middle of the street, each holding a map and pointing angrily at opposite directions. One of them, wearing a bowler hat and frustration like cologne, insists that the land you're standing on belongs to East Saginaw. The other, wearing suspenders and an "I'm too old for this" face, is shouting something about boundary rights and district overlaps. They're standing 5 feet apart and still can't agree on what town you're in. You begin to suspect that the real issue isn't the land itself, it's the paper. You step outside, lace your boots tight because nothing's more dangerous in this town than stepping in the wrong jurisdiction, and start wandering down a cobbled lane. In your pocket is a folded map you borrowed from the records office, printed just 3 years ago. It's beautiful, precise lines, carefully inked rivers, labeled roads. One problem: it shows East Saginaw and Saginaw City occupying the same space, like 2 transparent overlays fighting for cartographic dominance. Main Street curves through both towns. The Cass River snakes elegantly through the middle, trying its best to mind its own business while cartographers quietly panicked at you. Head to the town archives to sort this mess out, and the building itself gives you an uneasy welcome. The sign above the door reads, Saginaw City Cartography and Geographic Affairs, but below it, someone has nailed a smaller wooden plank that says, East Saginaw, Boundary Office Use, same door. Already you feel like you've entered a room with 2 people talking over each other, each pretending the other doesn't exist. Inside, there are maps. So many maps. Rolled, pinned, hung, folded, copied. You pull out one from 1857, East Saginaw only. Another from 1861, Saginaw City, but slightly shifted to the right. Then, one from 1869, boldly declaring both names with a tiny dashed line drawn awkwardly through someone's vegetable garden. You chuckle, but then you realize people lived their whole lives unsure whether their tomatoes were in a different city. A few maps even include hand-scribbled insults in the margins. One declares, "The East Saginaw grid mathematically inferior." The East reply, "Tell your mayor to learn what North means." This wasn't just a paperwork glitch, it was lived confusion. According to official state records, there were multiple instances where state-sponsored survey teams gave up mid-project. One frustrated draftsman allegedly threw a compass into the river and muttered, "Let Neptune sort it out." Fringe fact. That compass was supposedly found 50 years later by a child skipping rocks. She took it to school for show and tell and accidentally restarted the boundary debate. History never safe from school children. You step into the back office where a surprisingly young historian is cataloging the latest donations to the War of Two Towns exhibit. His name tag reads Eli, local geography nerd. He offers you tea and says, "Let me guess," trying to figure out which map is the real one. You nod. He sighs, gestures to a wall of framed documents, and mutters, "Join the Club." Eli tells you about an 1875 case in which two families' neighbors since forever both claimed the same half-acre of land based on conflicting city maps. The case went to court. Neither side won. The judge, unable to verify either town's jurisdiction, declared the land unassigned territory. For the next decade, no taxes were paid, no laws enforced, and one of the families opened a small tavern simply called Neutral Ground. It operated tax-free for 11 years before anyone noticed. There's still an open academic debate about how such confusion persisted for so long. Some scholars blame poor record-keeping in the early logging days. Saginaw was, after all, built during a timber boom when land was claimed with speed, whiskey, and vague directions like walk until you hit a tree, then turn left. Others argue that political stubbornness fueled the inconsistency. Each town updated its maps to reflect its preferred boundaries, which only further muddied the lines. A third theory popular among conspiracy-friendly locals says the towns deliberately blurred boundaries to confuse outside investors and retain local control over lucrative lumber plots. No proof, of course, but plenty of anecdotes and suspicious zoning records remain. You take a walk along what one 1888 map calls Division Avenue. It lives up to its name. On the left, East Saginaw signage, gas lamps, and narrow sidewalks. On the right, Saginaw City's broader curbs, taller lampposts, and a series of trees planted slightly more symmetrically. You pause mid-block, trying to spot the line. Where does East end and West begin? A local boy walks past and says, "You're in the middle now. We call it the maybe zone." You ask if that's official. "Nah," he says, "just what Grandma calls it." Grandma sounds wise. Further along the road, you pass an old bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk. It reads, "Site of the Great Surveyor Standoff, 1872. You sit by the marker, imagining the two men in tall hats arguing over where to place the new well. According to historical records, the dispute lasted 3 days and involved 5 horses, 3 engineers, and 1 deeply confused chicken. No well was ever built. The chicken, however, went on to win a small-town fair for most unintentional drama. At the local schoolhouse, now converted into a museum, you find a series of chalkboard sketches left behind from a geography lesson. One board shows overlapping town plans. Another shows the same river bent in 3 different ways. You're told that cartography lessons here used to include a disclaimer. All maps are approximate. Argue at your own risk. As you head back through the center of town, the setting sun casts a soft amber light over the street. For a moment, everything looks unified. Trees, shops, river, horizon, and yet, somewhere beneath your feet, invisible lines crisscross the soil. Borders on paper that defined livelihoods, taxes, marriages, property lines, school assignments. You wonder how many people lived and died unsure which town they belonged to. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it mattered too much. You pass a small bookshop where the owner is shelving yet another edition of a Citizen's Guide to Navigating Saginaw's Dual Bureaucracy. Volume 8. You ask how many volumes there are. He shrugs. "We stopped counting after they merged, but the problems, those kept going." The town, even in its peaceful dusk, still seems to hum with divided energy. You've seen the buildings, the bridges, the signposts, the maps all layered with a kind of historical double vision, like someone couldn't decide what the town wanted to be when it grew up, and so it became both. You find a bench near the river again, Settle in with your borrowed map folded like an origami mystery, and let your mind wander. Even now, scholars argue whether the town should have merged earlier. Some say unity brought stability. Others say the rivalry sparked innovation. And then there's always someone in the back row raising their hand to say, but wasn't it more fun when it was weird? You close your eyes, drifting into the idea that maybe, just maybe, the map wasn't wrong. Maybe the map was reflecting a truth more real than lines on paper. A town divided by ego, by pride, by paperwork, but bound together by people who somehow made it work, even if they didn't always agree on which side of the river they were standing on. A river runs between rivalries. You return once more to the river, the Cass, slow and silty, curling through the center of this endlessly disputed town like an old boundary line that got tired of being controversial. Its waters lap gently at the banks, unaware of the decades of bureaucratic drama that have danced on its shoulders. You stand at the edge, peering down into the murky shallows, where tadpoles dart between half-buried stones and the ghost of a wooden barrel bobs softly near. A cluster of reeds. On most days it looks like any quiet river, but here in Saginaw, East Saginaw, or Saginaw City, depending on which foot you're standing on, it's more than just a body of water. It's the laziest but most enduring character in a town that once split itself in two, stared into its own reflection, and said, I disagree. You follow a path along the east bank, passing a series of old posts where ferry ropes once stretched across the river. Before bridges, there were boats. Before organized ferry schedules, there were neighbors shouting. You going across. The river was both a highway and a division, carrying lumber rafts downstream while carrying gossip in both directions. If you squint, you can still see where one of the lumber docks used to sit, its beams now swallowed by mud and moss, remembered only by the occasional academic paper or fishing line snag. The river was the literal heart of the logging boom that made this region famous, with logs floated downstream from the vast forests of Michigan's north. On both sides of the Cass, lumber mills sprang up, and with them came jobs, saloons, families, troublemakers, church picnics, and inevitably rivalry. One side boasted faster processing, the other claimed better exports. One claimed their timber smelled sweeter, the other claimed their workers swore louder. You pass an old wooden sign half sunk in a bush that reads, Saginaw East Timber. You can smell the difference, a slogan lost to time but still faintly hilarious. You pause on the wooden footbridge that now crosses the river, one of the oldest in town, replaced countless times after floods, ice storms, and, once, a parade incident involving too many elephants. Yes, really. A traveling circus in 1889 overestimated the load-bearing capacity of the bridge. No elephants were harmed. The mayor's dignity was. This particular bridge once sparked one of the more absurd episodes in Saginaw's long tradition of self-inflicted headaches. The toll collection crisis of 1874. The east side built the bridge. The west side refused to help fund it. So the east side charged tolls. But halfway across the bridge, exactly halfway, mind you, was technically West Saginaw jurisdiction. So, West Saginaw hired their own toll collector. Result: citizens had to pay twice to cross the same bridge. It was described by one local as the world's most expensive 10 steps. Eventually, a third party, Mrs. Martha Biggins, a baker's widow, stood at the midpoint with a folding chair, handing out baked goods and sarcastic commentary. Her cinnamon rolls outlasted both toll booths. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the river should have been declared neutral ground. Some argue that the Cass, being a natural landmark, should have belonged to neither side. Others contend that East Saginaw had legitimate claim, having funded most of the docks and early maintenance. And then there's the fringe perspective that the river itself was a sentient spirit subtly sabotaging human order. You laugh, but one old fisherman swore he saw the Cass drag a town charter downstream and not give it back. The town clerk confirmed. A box of city records once floated away during a spring thaw and was never recovered. You wander toward the riverfront park, a modest space lined with benches and old Rottian lanterns. This area, once the hotbed of crosstown accusations and passive-aggressive community events, is now mostly quiet. But in the 1880s, the East Side held a festival here called River Unity Days, where both towns were invited. Problem: the West Side scheduled their own Cass celebration the same weekend, half a mile downstream. Neither event changed locations. You picture it: two brass bands playing over each other, each crowd pretending the other wasn't there, and one man on a canoe drifting between them with a sign that read, "Make friends, not ordinances." Still, the river united more than it divided. Both towns used it for transport. Both sent children to swim in it, though one side insisted their bank was healthier. Both relied on its ebb and flow to carry goods, gossip, and, occasionally, town council members in boats arguing about tax zones mid-paddle, and that's a verified fact. During the heated 1878 revenue debate, two council members allegedly met on a barge, drew chalk lines to indicate jurisdiction zones, and then refused to row back until they reached consensus. Spoiler, they didn't. They floated 6 miles before being towed back by laughing fishermen. Today, no one's quite sure where the old boundaries were drawn along the Cass. The river itself has shifted subtly over time, banks eroded, channels altered, shorelines redrawn by nature's quiet rebellion against paperwork. Scholars at the local university sometimes use aerial photographs from the 1930s to guess where the waterline stood during peak lumber years, but there's no real agreement. That's part of the beauty, really. History in this town is less a solid line and more a moving current. You stroll back along the west bank now, noting subtle differences: the stonework on the retaining wall, the lampost's height, even the benches' little signs that someone, long ago, wanted to say, "This side is better." But tonight, with the golden hue of twilight spilling across the water, there's no rivalry in sight, only slow ripples and sleepy birds. Trees bowing to their reflections like they've always agreed on where they stand. One final fringe story lingers in your mind, a tale often told but never confirmed. They say that in the late 1800s, a pair of lovers from opposing sides of Saginaw used to meet at a hidden spot on the riverbank each week. Neither family approved of the romance, and neither council wanted to acknowledge crosstown unions. So they carved their initials into a tree, built a tiny bench, and passed letters hidden in a hollow knot. No one knows their names, but one old elm, now thick with ivy and hollowed by time, still stands by the water. Locals call it the maybe tree. You stop by it on your walk just to sit, just to wonder. The Cass flows past, as it always has, indifferent, amused, and gently. Eternal. The same river that once marked invisible lines now carries leaves and lost coins. And maybe, just maybe, some quiet memory of a town that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. And so it became 2 towns, and then, eventually, just one. But the river, it never changed its name. Double taxes and triple confusion. You wake up to the clatter of hooves and the distant ringing of a bell, one of those triangle-shaped iron bells mounted to the side of a brick building. It tolls twice, once for Saginaw City, once for East Saginaw. You're not sure if it's meant to mark the hour or just to confuse people into being 5 minutes late for everything. You pull on your boots, still dusty from yesterday's riverbank walk, and open your door to find 2 envelopes neatly tucked under your welcome mat. You pick them up. The first is stamped with the dignified City of Saginaw, Department of Revenue. The second is nearly identical, except it reads, East Saginaw, Bureau of Civic Affairs. You open both. They're tax bills. Different figures, different due dates. Same house, you chuckle. Of course, out on the main street, townsfolk are murmuring to each other with that now familiar mix of polite confusion and Midwest intolerance. One man sighs as he reads his own pair of tax notices and mutters, "Must be autumn already." You approach a group of shopkeepers standing outside their stores, holding up papers like a game of bureaucratic poker. "What did you get?" one asks another. "East wants $42 for the sidewalk repair," says the butcher. "City wants $55 for paving enhancements." The group nods solemnly, as if trying to calculate whether the pavement's emotional value has changed since last winter. Double taxation wasn't just an accident in Saginaw, it was a lifestyle. During the height of the rivalry, residents were often sent conflicting bills from both municipalities. Some people paid both, just to avoid hassle. Others refused to pay either, claiming that overlapping jurisdiction invalidated the entire system. One brave soul, a man named Elijah Polk, famously marched into both city halls with a wheelbarrow full of pennies and declared, "This is my tribute to indecision." It took 3 clerks and an entire Saturday to count the coins. According to local legend, Polk was not fined, but was sent 12 separate receipts, none of which matched. You decide to investigate further, so you make your way to the Saginaw County Archives, where a retired tax assessor named Walter is known to volunteer a few days each week, mostly to tell stories and sneak hard candies from the display drawers. Walter's the kind of man who wears a tie to read newspapers and has a collection of ink pens sorted by decades of municipal betrayal. You ask him why the town ever tolerated such blatant confusion in its tax system. He leans back, hands clasped across his stomach, and says, because both sides thought they were right, and no one wanted to blink first. The historical truth is surprisingly well documented. From the 1860s through the 1880s, Saginaw residents were caught in a bureaucratic tug of the East claimed superior infrastructure and issued tax bills accordingly. The West claimed historical legitimacy and did the same. At times, properties were listed on both tax rolls. Some homes were recorded twice in county books, under slightly different spellings. One house, owned by a Mrs. Tabitha Linford, was listed once as 23 Chestnut Lane and again as 23 Chestnut Streets of blocks. Apart on paper but identical in reality. She contested both bills for years until someone renamed her street Middle Chestnut and called it a compromise. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether either side truly believed they had exclusive tax rights or whether it was just a matter of raising funds as fast as possible. Some argue it was an early form of economic brinkmanship, side betting the other would give in and merge. Others say it was just a paperwork avalanche with no brakes. The fringe theory, that it was an inside joke among clerks who wanted to see how long they could keep the illusion alive. One handwritten note found in a municipal drawer reads, "Try billing Jenkins twice next month. He never reads the fine print." No one knows who wrote it. Jenkins reportedly never noticed. You walked past the old tax collection building now, converted into a dental office, and notice a small plaque in the garden that reads, "Site of the Great Ledger Fire -1882. This refers to an actual event where a mishap with an oil lamp and a teetering stack of unpaid tax scrolls led to a blaze that destroyed records from both towns. The blaze wasn't major, but it was enough to erase a decade's worth of ledgers. No foul play was proven, but conspiracy theories abound. One version suggests the East Side started it to cancel all debts. Another version, much funnier, a squirrel knocked over the lamp. Walter, the retired assessor, just says, "Sometimes fire is kinder than paperwork." Back on the street, you run into a grocer who remembers stories his grandfather told about the triple tax trick of 1879, apparently. For a brief and glorious week, a third bill appeared in people's mailboxes, this one from a mysterious Committee of Unified Progress. No one could trace its origin. Some paid it out of habit, others ignored it. Eventually it was revealed to be a prank by a group of high school boys with a rubber stamp and too much free time. They were scolded by both councils, but later received the town's unofficial Spirit of Local Government Award as you cross the Cass River, once Morno told today. Thankfully you remember a story from a local teacher who had to submit to different salary declarations to receive her paycheck. One was signed by the East School Board. The other had to be notarized by a West accountant. She reportedly taught a week's worth of classes unpaid because the forms were misaligned by a single day. When asked how she kept her composure, she simply replied, "I drank tea," and imagined setting both buildings on fire. Walking through neighborhoods now, you see old houses that likely once bore the burden of overlapping tax demands. Their shutters are worn, their chimneys slightly crooked, but their porches remain proud. Some still display old metal plaques established 1865 East Saginaw on one side of the street, built 1867 Saginaw City proper on the other. A quiet rivalry lingers even now, long after the forms have faded and the stamps gone dry. There's a tranquil absurdity to the whole thing. You imagine a couple sitting at their kitchen table in 1881, comparing bills, laughing at the nonsense of it all, and wondering whether any of it really mattered. Maybe it didn't. Maybe paying twice just became a weird badge of civic honor. A town tax tradition, like grumbling about City Hall or arguing over whose potholes were deeper. You stop at a cafe that used to be the East Revenue Office, now known affectionately as the Double Bill. The menu includes the overcharged omelette and 2 receipts toast. The waitress brings you a coffee in a mug that reads, "I paid for this mug twice." You tip her in both East and West nickels. She smiles like it's not the first time, as twilight rolls over the rooftops again. You sit on a bench where 2 tax collectors once got into a fistfight over a property line that later turned out to be a typo. The story made the papers. Neither the man was fired. Instead, they were reassigned to opposing bridges. The absurdity of it all settles in like the evening fog, a town at war with itself, not with swords or muskets, but with stamps, ledgers, and a staggering ability to say, "We know it's broken, but it's ours." The case of the 2 mayors. You awake this time to a far more dramatic sound than usual, a brass band. Not just any brass band, mind you, but 2 brass bands, each belting out patriotic marches with the kind of passionate overcompensation usually reserved for high school rivalries or political parades involving unusually large hats. You throw on your coat, step outside, and what do you see? Saginaw City's mayor, top hat tilted, sash perfectly pressed, standing on the west side of the square, giving a thunderous speech from a podium covered in red bunting. A few yards away, across an invisible but very emotional line, East Saginaw's mayor is doing the exact same thing on a nearly identical podium, except his bunting is blue. Their voices overlap, their crowds cheer on cue, and a child waves two miniature flags at once. You've walked into the annual Double Mayor Day. Welcome. This wasn't always a town tradition. It was a necessity born of chaos. See, back in the late 1800s, when most American towns were consolidating local leadership into a single government, maybe even cutting costs and combining services, Saginaw doubled down, quite literally. Both sides insisted on maintaining their own fully functioning city governance. That meant to mayors, to city councils, to treasurers, and to completely separate philosophies about street lamp placement. And yes, to parades. On the same day, sometimes circling the same square at slightly staggered times to avoid awkward crossover. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes people just danced between both. The mayors, historically speaking, were a unique pair. While most towns have local legends about eccentric leaders, one mayor who kept goats, another who declared National Pickle Week, Saginaw had twice the material. In 1873, Mayor Charles T. Bingham of East Saginaw issued a statement declaring his city the commercial crown of the North. The same week, Mayor Joseph H. Webster of Saginaw City published a speech in the Daily Banner calling his town the soul of Michigan's future. Neither mentioned the other. It was as if both men were running separate countries inside the same postal code. One of the strangest verified episodes came in 1876, during what local historians now call the speech duel. Both mayors, having planned civic addresses on the same day, refused to reschedule. Their speeches began at the same hour, on the same steps of the courthouse, except one had claimed the east side steps and the other the west. The audience, caught in the middle, swiveled their heads like fans at a tennis match. No fists were thrown, but one observer wrote in his diary, "I was stirred, confused, and strangely entertained. A chicken sat on my lap and remained on by either vision of municipal destiny." There's still an open academic debate about whether the two-mayor system caused more harm than good. On one hand, it kept both governments sharp, constantly trying to outperform the other in roads, sanitation, and dramatic proclamations. On the other hand, it confused everyone else. One particularly dramatic case involved a local man who tried to register a business license with both mayors. Edge denied him, claiming it was the other mayor's jurisdiction. In the end, the man set up a floating lemonade stand on a raft in the Cass River. He became a local icon. His slogan, "Serving you from the middle." You pause at City Hall or one of the city halls. Anyway, East Saginaw's structure is near, with marble columns and an absurdly large clock that's permanently frozen at 2:17. Why 2:17? No one knows. Some say it's when the two mayors once accidentally agreed on a bill. Others say it's when the clockmaker quit out of sheer frustration after trying to file for city approval and getting bounced between offices for 6 months. The building is now used for civil ceremonies, tourism brochures, and light ghost tours. Meanwhile, on the west side, Saginaw City Hall is more modest. Red brick, slightly crooked roof, a brass weather vane shaped like a goose. Legend has it that during one particularly heated budget dispute, the East Mayor accused the West Mayor of running a government out of a bakery oven, to which the West Mayor replied, "Better than running it out of a mirror shop with no reflection." These insults were not metaphors. There was a mirror shop, there was a bakery oven, and both establishments had to put up signs saying, "We are not politically affiliated." You find a bench between the two buildings, right on the line where their shadows meet. A plaque on the ground reads, "Here stood the Peace Lemonade Table of 1881. That was the year when, fed up with the drama, two local women, Judith Ann Pemberley and Mrs. Dottie Krauses, set up a folding table in front of both city halls and offered lemonade and cookies to anyone who would promise not to shout. They wore sashes reading Saginaw Human. It's one of the few recorded moments in which both mayors showed up and shook hands, albeit while being handed a lemon square. There's a fringe theory still whispered about town that the double mayor system was a conscious satire, that some early leaders, bored of their own political impotence, decided to turn governance into civic theater. 2 stages, 2 actors, an endless rotation of over-serious speeches and polite disputes. Number 2. Proof, of course. But when you see that one mayor's portrait includes a monocle and the other has a falcon perched on his shoulder, you start to wonder. Back on Main Street, shopkeepers still debate which mayor had the better policies. A cobbler swears by East Saginaw's small business subsidies, a florist reminisces fondly about the West Spring Blossom Clean Streets Act, and a local librarian. She rolls her eyes and mutters. They both banned overdue fines at one point, but each claimed they invented it. Even old laws remain duplicated in city record books. One council prohibited roosters, the other declared roosters a symbol of masculine virtue. For a week in 1882, people walked roosters on leashes just to see who'd get fined. No one, was both cities just quietly removed the issue from public discussion. The parade wraps up as twilight descends. The brass bands are packing up, and the two mayors today's ceremonial actors dressed in throwback attire share a handshake and a soft laugh. You overhear one of them say, "See you next year, unless we secede again." The crowd chuckles. Old jokes like old buildings. Stick around in Saginaw. You walk home under lantern glow, passing storefronts and cobbled paths that remember every awkward argument and every petty rivalry. It's hard not to smile. In a world full of real danger, this was a town that once chose pageantry over pain, performance over violence, and if it meant having two mayors, two parades, and occasional confusion about who issued your parking ticket, maybe that was worth it. The town didn't split because of hatred. It split because of pride, because people believed their version of the truth was the most beautiful. And somehow, that stubborn beauty made for stories that are still told under soft lamps and quiet skies. Bridges, boats, and the battle for the middle. You wake to the soft creaking of wood underfoot, the rhythmic groan of planks contracting in the morning sun, and for a brief peaceful second, you wonder if you're aboard a ship. But no, you're simply walking across one of Saginaw's most storied landmarks, the Middle Bridge. Not east, not west, just middle. It spans the Cass River like a tired handshake between two old friends, who still don't like each other but have agreed to share lunch. Built in 1877, this particular bridge was meant to symbolize unity, at the very least, mutual stubbornness. Depending on who you ask, it either connected the towns or gave them a brand new location to fight over. Spoiler, they chose the second option. You stop at the center of the bridge, marked by a round bronze plaque that reads, "Geographical Neutrality Zone, no shouting permitted." Local lore says it was installed after a heated mayoral debate in which one candidate, mid-speech, accidentally slipped and fell into the river. Both towns claimed he fell from the other side. He was pulled out, soggy but uninjured, and famously shouted, "At least now I know who's downstream from whom." It became a t-shirt slogan decades later. Historically speaking, bridges were a deeply contentious issue between the two Saginaws in the mid-1800s. As both sides grew richer from lumber and shipping, demand for reliable crossings increased. The river had been a thoroughfare for floating logs, ferrying supplies, and occasionally, ferrying gossip. So bridge construction should have been obvious, but no. The East wanted tolls. The West wanted free passage. The East accused the West of using inferior timbers. The West accused the East of placing support beams without moral consideration. One councilman reportedly said, "I'd rather swim than cross something funded by East Saginaw's mayoral office." So he swam, got pneumonia, was fined for unauthorized bathing. The first formal bridge plan was drafted in 1865. It was promptly vetoed by both councils, not because of cost, but because each demanded naming rights. East Saginaw wanted to call it the Victory Span. Saginaw City countered with Heritage Crossing. A fringe proposal from a particularly poetic alderman suggested the bridge. Of reason, it received no votes. Eventually, the compromise name Cass River Bridge No. 3 was chosen, on the basis that numbers hurt fewer feelings than words. You continue across the structure, noting the peculiar way it changes styles. Halfway across, wooden planks on one side, cobblestone on the other. As if two different work crews gave up halfway and decided to just meet in the middle. That's not just a cute story, it actually happened. A real construction crew from East Saginaw laid wooden planks until they ran out. Meanwhile, a West team started from their end with stones. When they met, someone shrugged and said, "Level enough." That phrase is still muttered today whenever anything in Saginaw is fixed slightly off-center. There's an ongoing academic debate about whether these bridges were symbols of failure or triumph. Some scholars argue they represent a unique form of American pluralism, a civic structure literally built from compromise. Others suggest they're physical proof that indecisiveness can become permanent infrastructure. A third, more romantic, theory insists that the bridges were never about efficiency. They were theatrical, designed as stages where the town could act out its identity crisis. After all, if both sides stood on opposite ends, waving banners and shouting about how correct they were, wasn't that technically performance art? Below the bridge, you watch as a small rowboat glides slowly along the water. It's manned by an elderly couple wearing matching straw hats. They drift past lazily, oars barely dipping, letting the current carry them. You call down and ask which town they're from. The woman waves and yells, "Depends where the tax bill came from." "This month," the man adds. "We just say from the river, sounds more peaceful." You like them instantly. The Cass River hosted more than just boats and disputes. It also became the unlikely site of the bridge lights incident in 1884. For the annual spring jubilee, both towns decided to decorate the bridge with lanterns set. The east side used blue glass lanterns. The west used red. The resulting effect was visually striking but deeply annoying to both councils. The east accused the red glow of symbolizing financial recklessness. The west claimed the blue lights, who made the bridge look haunted. The towns never agreed again on shared lighting, which is why modern-day photos of the bridge often show one side with string lights and the other in tasteful darkness. At the far end of the bridge, you find a small stand selling hand-painted river stones. The vendor, an older gentleman with a long beard and a longer memory, tells you each stone is marked with a number from 1 to 99. When you ask why there's number 100, he chuckles, because that would mean we finished something. He hands you stone number 47, painted with the outline of the bridge and the words "halfway is far enough." You drop a few coins in the box and carry your philosophical rock like a souvenir from a dream. As you make your way down to the docks, where the river widens into slow-moving puddles of copper and light, you see old pilings from former bridge attempts. Some start and stop with no logic. One is just 3 beams standing at odd angles, like someone gave up halfway through a game of river Jenga. These were real attempts, some funded, some not, all debated to exhaustion. One such project, known only as Bridge Proposal Number 12, involved a drawbridge so narrow it was declared unsafe before completion. It became a favorite fishing spot instead. Kids nicknamed it the Plank of Debate. There's even a song and old folk tune passed down in Saginaw families called The Ballad of Bridge Number 4. No one agrees on the lyrics. Some versions are patriotic, some mournful, others just silly. One line goes, "I crossed the bridge and paid my toll, then paid again to reach my goal." Another version rhymes mayor's lies with lumber pies, whatever that means. Still, the song is sung every year at the Unity Festival, often off-key and always with a smile. You sit by the water's edge as the sun begins its slow, golden descent behind the willow trees. Across the river, the bridge now glows faintly with evening lanterns, red on one side, blue on the other. No one minds anymore. A jogger runs across it, pausing only to stretch at the center. A group of teenagers skate past, wheels clattering from plank to cobble. Somewhere, a musician begins to play an old tune on a fiddle. It echoes softly across the river, bouncing from mayoral stonework to forgotten toll booths. This town, with its endlessly splitting personality, its double names and triple claims, still finds a way to move forward slowly, maybe sideways but forward nonetheless. You close your eyes. Let the river hum, let the bridge creak, let the stories rest gently like leaves floating downstream. Tomorrow, maybe you'll cross it again, or maybe you'll just sit and listen. Schools, syllabuses, and the geography quiz that started a riot this morning. You find yourself standing on a freshly swept front porch, holding a cup of coffee that tastes exactly like municipal funding, lukewarm, slightly bitter, but somehow still comforting. You look out over the town as children begin to wander down cobbled streets, books in hand, lunch tins swinging like tiny metal pendulums. They're headed to school, of course, but which school? That's the million-dollar question here in historic Saginaw, a place where even the blackboards once disagreed about what town you were in. As you follow a small group of kids toward their destination, they begin to splinter at the corner. Half turn right toward East Saginaw Schoolhouse. No, two. The other half veer left toward Saginaw City Grammar Hall. You could throw a stone and hit both buildings from the corner if you aimed well, which, as it turns out, someone once did during the infamous geography quiz riot of 1883. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Education in divided Saginaw was a bureaucratic riddle, a daily logic puzzle wrapped in chalk dust and handwritten report cards. Both towns, proud and unyielding, built their own schools, hired their own teachers, and created their own standards for nearly everything down to how cursive G were taught. East Saginaw favored looped elegance. Saginaw City leaned toward minimalist strokes. The result, a generation of students who could identify classmates by the shape of their handwriting and mock them accordingly. Yes, snobby penmanship was alive and well. Inside East Saginaw Schoolhouse, no You find long wooden desks, walls adorned with patriotic banners, and an old globe with half the continents slightly off. The teacher, Miss Adelaide Pruitt, once led a civic initiative to declare cursive as the truest mark of moral fiber. Across town, Mr. Harrison Bletchley at Saginaw City Grammar Hall believed typing was the future and that penmanship was an outdated Victorian vanity. These two never met, but were once quoted in rival newspapers criticizing the other side's tragic educational regressions. The town's children, however, knew better. They passed notes across jurisdictional lines, swapped textbooks under lunch tables, and occasionally met after school to compare vocab lists, just to make sure they wouldn't be blindsided at the regional spelling bee, which of course led us to the great academic disaster, the 1883 Cass County School Contest. It was meant to be a showcase of educational excellence. Students from both towns competed in math, history, and geography in front of a panel of judges, brought in from out of town. What could go wrong? Well, during the final round of the geography quiz, a contestant from East Saginaw was asked to name the capital of East Saginaw. He proudly declared, "East Saginaw," naturally. But a student from Saginaw City jumped up, waved a paper, and declared, "That's not a valid city, it's a district." Gasps. Then a second contestant declared that the two towns weren't actually distinct at all, but misguided reflections of a pre-industrial myth. The judges were flustered. The crowd was louder than a lumberjack convention. A small chalkboard was thrown. No one was seriously hurt, unless you count a bruised ego or two. The press dubbed it the Blackboard Battle. There's still an open scholarly debate about what actually caused the escalation. Some argue it was the poorly phrased question. Others blame the town's long-standing confusion over its own civic identity. A few claim the whole thing was staged by parents trying to force a merger of the school districts. And then there's the fringe theory that one of the judges was secretly a local playwright who used the chaos as material for his later work to towns. One Test, a civic tragedy in 3 acts. A few dusty copies still exist in the town. Library, shelved under humor. Attempted. You visit that very library next, housed in what used to be the West Saginaw Superintendent's office. Its left wing is noticeably longer than its right, thanks to an East-funded reading expansion grant that only half the town approved. The architecture reflects its split personality, half Greek revival, half whatever style the east could afford that month. Inside, you flip through old yearbooks, and they're just as contradictory. One year's book declares the school's colors are red and gold. The next year they're blue and silver. In the margin of one class photo, someone scribbled "Go Griffins," only for the next year's team to be called the Steam Donkeys. The mascot situation, you discover, was never settled. School funding was equally absurd. Both towns taxed their citizens to support their own schools, which often meant you could live in one town, but your children's school was on the other side of the river. The result? People paying into one system while sending their kids into another. A logistics nightmare. One brave mother, Mrs. Celeste Dawkins, famously rowed her child across the river every morning to avoid the East's curriculum, which she claimed ignored the fundamental dignity of fractions that, quote, later appeared on protest signs. During the Great Math Walkout of 1885, yes, that was a thing. You walk past one of the few remaining original chalkboards now housed in the museum annex. Faint marks are still visible, spelling lists, math problems, and in the lower left corner, the phrase, "We are not East, we are better," written in flowing cursive, no less. Across town, in the attic of the East Schoolhouse, someone once found a dusty slate with the message, "Our vowels are purer." The two are now displayed side by side in a glass case titled "Passive Aggression in Education." Despite the rivalry, the students themselves often found ways to cross boundaries figuratively and literally. Annual dances were occasionally held at neutral barns, and debate teams sometimes practiced in secret just to prepare for dual perspectives. One class of 1891 even created their own shared textbook, combining both syllabuses and annotating where opinions differed. That book is now referred to as the Saginaw Compromise, and one rare copy still survives. The cover reads, "Prepared by children because adults couldn't figure it out." You settle on a park bench near one of the old schools. Children play nearby, chasing each other under century-old elms that once shaded lunchtime arguments over who had the better recess equipment. A grandfather nearby tells his granddaughter a story about his own school days. "We didn't always agree," he says, "but we all learned how to listen even if we didn't like what we heard." And maybe that's the odd beauty of it. In a town where syllabuses split like railroad tracks and math classes could start civil wars, the students found a way to learn despite the adults. They memorized capitals, recited poetry, whispered sarcasm during tests, and grew up with a strangely flexible sense of where things started and where they stopped. The bell from a nearby schoolhouse rings gently metal on metal, not quite in tune. You sip the last of your coffee and smile. Education here wasn't perfect. It was fractured, contradictory, and often completely ridiculous, but it was real. And in its messy, doubled-up way, it taught an entire generation one very important lesson: how to live in a world where the answers aren't always written on the same chalkboard. Fire departments, false alarms, and the great bucket argument. The bells ring out again this morning, not church bells, not school bells, but the sharp, clanging cry of an old brass fire bell. You jump up, startled, and for a moment your heart kicks into that delightful little gallop reserved for emergencies that may or may not involve cats in trees. You rush toward the sound, expecting smoke, shouting, chaos. But when you arrive at the scene, there's no fire in sight. Instead, there are two vintage fire wagons parked awkwardly nose to nose in the middle of Mulberry Street, their horses snorting impatiently, and two groups of firemen arguing loudly over whose hydrant this is. Welcome to the Saginaw Fire Saga. In a town split so precisely down the middle that even blazes respected jurisdiction lines, firefighting became an unexpected battlefield of civic pride. By the mid-1800s, both East Saginaw and Saginaw City had their own fire departments, not just volunteer brigades, full departments, with shiny red wagons, brass helmets, uniforms, and entirely different philosophies about how water should behave. The East favored leather hoses, imported from Boston. The West swore by canvas hoses, stitched by local cooperatives. Neither trusted the other's nozzles, and each refused to share buckets on principle. The inevitable result: fires turned into competitions. One of the earliest recorded turf wars took place in 1868, when a warehouse near the river burst into flames. Both departments arrived within minutes, hooves pounding, men shouting, water sloshing. Unfortunately, the East team approached from the south, the West from the north, and neither side would yield position. The fire, being wonderfully nonpartisan, continued burning merrily while the captains of each brigade argued over hydrant access and hose threading techniques. By the time a compromise was reached, each allowed one nozzle rotated every 10 minutes. The building had become what polite reports called a warm memory. From then on, fire calls became theatrical events. Crowds would gather just to watch both departments arrive, each boasting sleeker wagons or louder bells. It was said that children began playing East firemen versus West firemen in alleyways, pretending to throw water buckets while shouting slogans like "Canvas beats cowhide" or "East flows faster." Merchants began sponsoring teams, and for a while, there were rumors of a planned annual fireman pageant. It never happened. Someone burned the application forms. You stop at one of the original firehouses, now a bakery, where the old brass bell still hangs above the doorway. A plaque beside the door reads, "In honor of the men who rang it first and the men who argued second." Inside, the scent of cinnamon and soot mingle in a way that feels entirely appropriate. Historians still argue about which department was more effective. Official records suggest the East Fire Brigade responded faster on average, but also filed more complaints about hydrant placement sabotage. The West, meanwhile, was known for creative problem-solving, including the famous reverse bucket line strategy of 1875, where water was passed from the river to the fire in a chain that included 3 barbers, 1 shoemaker, and a dog named Rufus. It worked barely. The dog became a minor celebrity, but nothing compares to the legendary Great Bucket Argument of 1879. It started when a routine chimney fire on Oak Street escalated into a turf war over all things a wooden bucket. Both departments claimed ownership of the same bucket, a sturdy, iron-banded number marked B04. The East insisted it was borrowed months earlier and never returned. The West claimed it was found abandoned in a ditch during a drill. The fire was extinguished mostly, but the argument raged for weeks. Letters were sent. Witnesses testified. At one point, a schoolteacher drew a diagram of the bucket's known movements. In the end, the bucket was locked in the mayor's office as evidence. It was never seen again. Some say it's buried beneath the town's war memorial. There's even a fringe theory, again beloved by local teens, that the bucket was stolen by a secret society called the Brotherhood of the Hose, who believed that unity between the two departments would only come when the original bucket was reunited with its handle. No evidence of the society exists, though someone once carved those words into a park bench today. There's an annual event known as the Saginaw Bucket Relay, where modern firefighters, now part of a unified department, thank goodness, race across town in teams, passing water buckets while dressed in 19th century uniforms. It's mostly symbolic. No fires are fought. Prizes include honorary badges and pies. But the point is clear. Unity, once impossible, is now celebrated with good-natured splashing and laughter. You visit the fire museum next. Yes, it's real. Marvel at relics like hand-cranked sirens, soot-blackened helmets, and hose couplings so incompatible you'd swear they were designed by opposing chess teams. One exhibit lets you try to attach two rival nozzles together. You fail spectacularly. A volunteer tells you, you're not supposed to succeed. It's tradition. Outside again, you notice an old hydrant painted half red, half blue. No plaque, no explanations, just a silent nod to a century of civic bickering. Across the street, someone has stenciled the phrase "in case of fire, argue responsibly" on a brick wall. You make a note of it. It feels like the town's true motto. As the day winds down, you walk past quiet houses, their chimneys now cold and safe. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint clang of a bell, probably ceremonial. But for just a second, you imagine two fire teams rushing in from opposite sides, horses thundering, men shouting, the ghost of a bucket swinging between them like a symbol of stubborn, beautiful inefficiency. Saginaw may have fought its fires with confusion, but it never lacked passion. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the town still stands smoke-stained. Yes, but still here, still warm, still ready to argue about hoses. Courthouses, confessions, and the case of the stolen gavel. You wake up today to the sound of a gavel, not the sharp, definitive crack of courtroom justice, but a dull thunk-thunk against wood, like someone trying to get the attention of a particularly stubborn watermelon. As you emerge from your room and step into the heart of historic Saginaw, you discover the noise is coming from a reenactment of a town hall meeting. Actors in old-timey clothes are shouting things like, "I move to table the motion to object to the objection," while townsfolk chuckle from the sidewalk eating caramel corn. It's civic theater at its most gloriously tangled. You sit on a bench outside the old East Saginaw courthouse, a proud limestone structure with Roman columns and a suspicious crack running down the side that locals say appeared the day someone suggested the West's judge was too lenient with fishmonger licensing violations. Across the river, you can see the other courthouse, smaller, more austere, like a twin who gave up on drama and embraced accounting. That one belongs to what was once Saginaw City. The rivalry between the two legal institutions, of course, was just as ridiculous as everything else. For nearly 40 years, each town had its own court system, its own judges, juries, clerks, bailiffs, gavel sets, and preferred ink color for legal documents: blue for East Saginaw, black for Saginaw City, red for emergencies only. Trials were held simultaneously in both buildings, sometimes for the same case. A man once sued his neighbor over a fence dispute in East Saginaw, only to be countersued in Saginaw City the same week over excessive whistling. Neither case acknowledged the other. Eventually, the two rulings canceled each other out, and the men remained neighbors, bitter ones until death. You wander inside the East Courthouse, now converted into a civic museum. The front chamber holds artifacts like the ceremonial clerk's pen plated in nickel, suspiciously heavy, and a judge's robe rumored to be made of imported ostrich wool chosen for its impartial texture. There's a small framed photograph of Judge Horace T. Willoughby, East Saginaw's famously theatrical magistrate, known for saying things like, "Justice is a dance, and I shall lead," before dismissing minor charges with a wink. He once held a defendant in contempt for falling asleep during a trial about municipal hay-stacking ordinances. Meanwhile, Saginaw City's courthouse boasted Judge Marietta Boone, a no-nonsense pioneer in regional jurisprudence, often called the hammer in a petticoat. She kept her court impeccably silent and once fined herself 5 cents for using the word balderdash without precedent. Her gavel was carved from an old maple tree that allegedly stood at the exact halfway point between both towns. That gavel would later go missing under very strange circumstances. Which brings us to the infamous case of the stolen gavel, 1891. It began with a routine session on property tax appeals. Judge Boone opened court as usual, only to find her gavel missing from its pedestal. Panic spread. The courtroom was locked. No witnesses reported movement. A hastily assembled jury of 3 stenographers and 1 janitor was sworn in on the spot to investigate. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Willoughby opened his own court session brandishing a suspiciously familiar gavel. The town exploded with speculation. Was this theft? A prank? A symbolic declaration of judicial superiority? The press dubbed it the gavel napping. Editorial cartoons showed a gavel with legs tiptoeing across a bridge under cover of darkness. Judge Willoughby claimed he found it outside near a pigeon. Judge Boone demanded its immediate return, issuing a court order backed by the full force of local indignation. The gavel was returned 3 days later by mail, with no return address. It arrived in a velvet pouch, along with a note that read, "This instrument of law deserves one courtroom, not 2 circuses." The handwriting was never identified. Some believe it came from a law clerk sick of filing everything twice. Others insist it was a ghost, possibly that of a long-deceased bailiff who'd warned everyone not to split justice down the river. This strange episode has become the subject of much academic debate. Some see it as a protest, a turning point in public opinion that began pushing the 2 courts toward unification. Others claim it was a last hurrah mischievous act from within the legal system itself, reminding everyone how absurd things had gotten. A few fringe historians even propose the idea that there never were 2 separate gavels, that the towns shared one all along, passing it back and forth under elaborate rules of silence. You step into the former jury room, which has been left almost untouched. 12 chairs arranged in an imperfect semicircle, a chalkboard listing past cases, rooster roaming violation, unauthorized ice skating, and singing too loud near church bells. These were real municipal crimes in the 1870s. One man charged with excessive accordion use in public successfully defended himself by demonstrating his technique and receiving a standing ovation. The fine was waived. You examine an old courtroom bench with initials carved into the wood, MB plus JH, perhaps to clerks, or to lovers from opposing court systems, meeting in secret over legal briefs and afternoon tea. Their story, if it existed, is lost to time, but the bench remains. Visitors still sit there and whisper questions like, who needed this much paperwork? And paperwork, indeed, was a Saginaw specialty. Both courts insisted on separate documentation, even for shared civic issues. That meant 2 sets of building permits, marriage licenses, fishing approvals, and, yes, cat ownership certificates. There was a brief era in which you could be legally married in East Saginaw but technically divorced. In Saginaw City, couples who discovered this loophole often just moved downriver and pretended nothing happened. You walk now along the old legal corridor that once separated the town records office from the bailiff's quarters. It's narrow, dim, and lined with faded portraits of unsmiling legal clerks holding overstuffed file folders. One plaque reads, "Here sat the man who copied every birth certificate twice, by hand, without complaint, until he complained." Another notes, "This hallway stored all documents beginning with the letter Q, a strange choice but perfectly on brand for a town that refused to alphabetize its citizens." In the final room of the museum, there's a small desk with a replica gavel you're allowed to touch. You pick it up, solid, worn, symbolic. A sign encourages you to give it a try. Bang once for unity, twice for nostalgia. You choose both. The echo rings out, soft and hollow, across the quiet room. No judge appears. No rival court files an objection. Just silence, and the comforting creak of the wooden floor. Outside again, the reenactors have wrapped up. One tips his hat at you and says, "Court is adjourned until further notice, or until the mayor changes his mind again." You nod, strangely comforted. Here in Saginaw, justice was never just blind, it was double-visioned, contradictory and beautifully absurd. But somehow, through all the trials and paperwork, the town never stopped believing that fairness mattered even if they couldn't agree on whose stamp to use. Banks, ledgers, and the $2 coin. Nobody wanted you stroll down Copper Street just after lunch, your pockets light, your steps slower than usual, and your thoughts drifting toward financial matters. Not the modern kind with passwords and algorithms, but the old, satisfyingly clunky kind. Brass safes, thick paper ledgers, and money that actually clinked when it moved. In historic Saginaw, of course, money was never just money. It was politics, it was identity. And depending on which side of the river you stood on, a coin from the wrong bank might as well have been a fancy washer. You find yourself facing 2 buildings again, big surprise, each with ornate stone facades and arched windows. The one on the left reads Saginaw City Trust and Investment House, carved in bold Roman type. The one on the right, not to be outdone, is labeled First Mutual Bank of East Saginaw, and someone's recently polished the eagle ornament above the door until it gleams like a coin fresh from the mint. Both claim to be the oldest. Both claim to be the original. Neither has ever admitted that the other might, under certain definitions, also be a bank. In the mid to late 1800s, Saginaw's economic boom, fueled by timber, shipping, and stubborn optimism, meant there was money everywhere. The only problem, no one could agree on whose money counted. Each town printed its own banking notes. That's right, not just separate currency handling policies, but entirely separate currencies. Not federal notes, mind you. These were privately backed, locally circulated banknotes with long names like 1 East Saginaw Commercial Dollar or 5 City of Saginaw Lumber tokens. Some featured prominent local faces. Others had pictures of pine trees, schooners, or in one case a very muscular-looking otter. You walk into the East Saginaw Bank Museum, formerly a vault, now filled with exhibits. There's a whole wall of framed notes, each more ornate than the last. One has a small poem along the bottom: to build, to float, to trade and stack. East Saginaw shall not look back. Another, dated 1872, is marked valid within town limits only. Imagine trying to use that across the river, and many did try unsuccessfully. One of the most famous incidents involved a traveling preacher who attempted to buy lunch in West Saginaw with a $10 note from the East Bank. The bartender stared at it, flipped it over, sniffed it, and finally said, "This smells like policy." He accepted it, but only after charging a 15% conversion fee, which he pocketed immediately. The preacher later recounted the tale in a sermon about spiritual fraud. Then came the introduction of the $2 coin. In 1884, in a bizarre show of attempted unity, both towns agreed briefly, and under pressure from investors, to a shared piece of currency, the Saginaw bicentennial $2 coin. The idea was bold, the execution less so. One side of the coin bore the likeness of East Saginaw's founding merchant, Jeremiah Brackenridge, frowning nobly at a distant forest. The reverse showed Saginaw City's early civic leader, Henrietta McCullough, holding a ledger and what might have been a pie chart. It was meant to symbolize balance instead. It sparked chaos. People on both sides claimed the coin had been weighted to favor the other town's portrait. Someone measured and reported a .003 millimeters bulge under Brackenridge's beard. A West Side editor called it the smirk of bias. A fringe group formed called Citizens for a Flat Coin, demanding remints and refunds. The coin was quickly nicknamed the flip-flop, and some merchants refused it altogether, claiming it confused the cash drawer. The banks themselves didn't help. Each insisted that while the coin was legal, they would only redeem it at reduced face value unless it came from a known customer. This policy, naturally, led to people writing letters of introduction, just to spend their own money. One such letter survives today, written on embossed stationery: "Dear Sir, kindly honor this coin tendered by my brother-in-law who supports the East Side politically but shops honorably in your district." You glance at a replica of the infamous coin in a display case, its surface worn smooth by decades of debate. Next to it sits a sign that reads, "Minted in compromise, circulated in confusion, retired in silence." Banks in both towns were also notorious for having slightly different hours. Saginaw City's banks opened at 8:30 a.m. sharp and closed at 4 p.m., while East Saginaw's preferred a fashionable 9:15 to 3:45 schedule. This meant it was entirely possible, depending on your errand, to be between hours and have no access to banking services for exactly 30 minutes. One clever entrepreneur started a pop-up coffee cart called Banker's Lament that operated in that awkward window. His most popular item, the $half donut, available only with East Side coinage. You stop by a preserved telewindow, where behind the iron grill sits a wax figure of a banker, mustache stern, pen poised. He's based on real historical figure Julius Fenimore, who famously refused to accept a stack of Saginaw City notes unless they were presented in ascending serial number order. The customer spent 20 minutes rearranging them on the floor. Fenimore nodded gravely and processed the deposits. A scholarly debate continues to this day over whether these rival banks helped or hurt the town's economies. Some argue that dual currencies encouraged healthy competition and fiscal innovation. Others believe it led to rampant inefficiency, lost investment, and at least one man who buried his savings in a coffee can because he couldn't remember which ledger his deposit went to. The can was found in 1954. The money was moldy. The can is in the museum. Fringe economic theorists propose that the banks were never meant to unify, that they functioned as cultural anchors, giving each half of the town a shared identity wrapped in hard currency. One 1980s paper from the University of Michigan even suggested the banks were early experiments in localized economic pride building, which is a polite way of saying financial stubbornness with decorative vaults. As you step out into the late afternoon sun, the glint of copper coins and paper notes seems to echo in the warm light. You notice an old plaque on the sidewalk that says simply, "Here stood the teller who asked, 'And which Saginaw do you mean?' And That's the question, isn't it? In a town where even cash had an opinion, your money didn't just speak, it chose sides, but still, somehow both banks stood tall, both counted, both told a version of the truth. And just like the town's many coins, it turns out the real value wasn't in what side you spent on, but in what side you were willing to walk across the river for. Church bells, doctrinal disputes, and the Holy Choir showdown. You awake on a Sunday morning to the sound of not one, but two church bells ringing out of sync, naturally. One chimes at a crisp 7:59 a.m., the other at a leisurely 8:07. You pause to count them, 12 from the east, 11 from the west. A minor difference, perhaps, or maybe, in Saginaw's delightfully divided past. Even divine numerals weren't safe from local politics. As you walk toward the spiritual center of town, or rather, centers plurally, you're greeted by two towering steeples that look almost like they're in mid-conversation across the trees. The first belongs to St. Brigid's First Church of East Saginaw, its spire, elegant, Gothic, and mildly overconfident. The other, slightly chunkier but proud in its simplicity, is the United Fellowship Chapel of Saginaw City. Both claim to be the oldest active congregation in the county. Both claim to have baptized more lumbermen than the other. Both claim God liked their hymns best. In theory, religion might have been the one thing to bring a divided town together. In practice, well, this was Saginaw. You settle into a pew at St. Brigid's, where the smell of wax and pine polish fills the air, and the windows depict biblical scenes in which everyone's somehow wearing 19th century frock coats. A young altar boy lights the final candle while the choir warms up. Angelic voices with the occasional off-note that someone will later passive-aggressively mention at coffee hour. St. Brigid's was known for its ritual, its incense, and its elaborate church bulletins for pages minimum, with seasonal poetry. The choir wore full robes, sang in Latin when feeling fancy, and once performed an entire service in Gregorian chant after a bishop from Boston visited. One parishioner fainted from sheer reverence or possibly lack of breakfast. Meanwhile, across the river at the United Fellowship Chapel, things were simpler. Hymns were sung with gusto and volume. The organist was a retired steamboat captain who played by ear. Sermons lasted precisely 31 minutes, followed by donuts and spirited discussion. They didn't do incense, they had a warm fan, but what they lacked in ornament, they made up for in warmth. Their motto, carved above the pulpit, read, "Fewer frills, more faith." The two congregations coexisted in relative peace until the choir incident of 1888. It began as an innocent idea, a shared Christmas concert, held in the old grain hall downtown. Both choirs agreed to perform, and for one brief moment, there was unity in Saginaw. Flyers were printed, a set list was approved. Rehearsals were held separately, of course. But just before the event, disaster struck. The choir master from St. Brigid's, Reginald Forsyth, known for wearing velvet gloves year-round, suggested rearranging "O Come All the Faithful" to include a Latin bridge. The United Fellowship conductor, Hattie Mae Broom, fired back that Latin is the language of road signs, not rejoicing. Sparks flew, tempers flared. The concert opened with a fragile duet and ended in a chaotic musical standoff that has since become the stuff of local legend. By the time Silent Night was attempted, each choir was singing in a different key. Someone dropped a bell. A child in the front row wept, yet somehow the audience still clapped out of confusion. Holiday spirit, or both. Newspapers the next day ran the headline, "Tidings of Comfort and Yells." An editorial in the East Saginaw Clarion claimed the event was a courageous failure in the name of celestial harmony. The Saginaw City Weekly, however, described it as a heretical cacophony sponsored by overly dramatic tenors. Today, music historians still debate the incident. Some say it represented the inevitable clash of musical cultures. Others argue it was staged to distract from a failed tax initiative. And of course, there's the fringe theory that the choirs were secretly in cahoots, pushing a new experimental genre, dueling gospel, which never caught on. Outside of one rural county in Wisconsin, you pass by both churches now, their bells silent, their doors open. On St. Brigid's bulletin board, there's a flyer for next month's joint pancake breakfast, a modest attempt at unity. Below it, someone has scribbled Latin optional. Inside the chapel, a display case shows relics from the old choir feud sheet. Music with crossed-out notes, a cracked tuning fork, and a lace-trimmed handkerchief said to have belonged to Forsyth himself. It's embroidered with the words, "Pitch is eternal." You sit quietly in one of the back pews, listening to the faint creak of floorboards and the gentle tick of the wall clock. A ray of sunlight streams through a stained glass panel depicting two shepherds, each holding a differently shaped lamb. It's subtle, But once you notice, you can't unsee it. Not far away, in the cemetery between the two churches, you notice the gravestones, some with crosses, some plain, east and west, side by side. The divisions of town, of doctrine, of choir robes and hymn preferences, all washed away by time. There's even a bench in the middle, marked, "Sit here if you're not sure which service to attend." You imagine a world where the bells had once rung together, perfectly synchronized. Would it have changed anything? Maybe not. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the beauty of Saginaw's spiritual life wasn't in agreement, but in the music they created while trying to agree, even if it made dogs howl. As you step back into the golden afternoon, a gentle breeze carries the distant echo of a hymn, slightly off-key but undeniably heartfelt, and maybe that's the most sacred sound of all. Bridges, barges and the Battle of the Drawspans. You find yourself standing at the edge of the Cass River. Early morning mist still draped across the water, like someone forgot to clear away yesterday's clouds. A faint breeze lifts your collar as you squint at the silhouette of a bridge. No wait, two bridges rising side by side like competing eyebrows. One is wrought iron, delicately arched, bearing a sign that reads East Saginaw Municipal Crossing, EST 1864. The other is wider, more utilitarian, with a stone base and a larger sign, Saginaw City Transit Span, founded 1865, rebuilt 1870, rebuilt again 1871. Rebuilding was apparently a municipal hobby. Bridges, to most towns, are symbols of unity, but here in historical Saginaw, bridges were the most literal battlegrounds of all. In the 19th century, both Saginaw City and East Saginaw built bridges across the Cass River, not to connect with each other, mind you, but to demonstrate that they didn't need to. Each side invested in its own drawbridge, complete with toll booths, gatehouses, and in one memorable case, decorative stone griffins. Each bridge was proudly declared independent. Neither bridge was terribly cooperative. They operated on different opening schedules, which is as chaotic as it sounds when barges needed to pass and townspeople needed to cross. You stroll across the East Bridge first, where the iron grating rattles underfoot. A plaque tells you this bridge once opened every hour on the hour, except during town meetings, funerals, or when the operator was feeling peevish. The rival bridge opened every half hour except on Sundays, or if someone from East Saginaw had recently insulted the toll staff. That last clause was never officially codified, but widely understood. Naturally, this system caused complications. River traffic in the 1870s was no joke. Barges floated timber, grain, hay, ice, and, at one point, an entire wedding party that insisted on arriving by water for the drama. When both drawbridges refused to lift simultaneously, captains began carrying bribes in their pocketbooks and tried to time their journeys based on the emotional moods of bridge operators. One local pilot, Josiah Slow Rudder Dean, claimed he once sat between the bridges for 7 hours with a cargo of perishable onions. By the time he docked, they'd sprouted. The towns didn't care. They fined him for vegetable expansion in restricted zones. The pinnacle of this absurdity came during the Great Drawspan Standoff of 1877. That summer, East Saginaw's bridge underwent emergency maintenance, forcing all river traffic to rely on Saginaw City's bridge, the west side, not one to miss. An opportunity implemented what they called a resource compensation levy, charging double tolls to anyone carrying goods with East Saginaw intent. East Saginaw retaliated by parking an empty barge directly beneath the west drawbridge, blocking it open during peak hours and citing river mooring rights. The situation escalated into a full-blown municipal dispute. Letters were exchanged. Threats were implied. Someone tried to build a raft bridge overnight. It sank. Local children reenacted the standoff with popsicle sticks and bathtubs, while elderly residents placed bets on which town would cave first. It all ended when a surprise thunderstorm flooded the bridge gears and rendered both inoperable for a week. The barges moved on. The onions grew moldy, and both sides quietly dropped the issue until the next spring. You reach the midpoint of the bridge now, where the town once attempted a bridge neutral zone. It was a literal plank platform, bolted between the two drawspans, painted a cheerful shade of diplomatic beige. Here, pedestrians from either town could meet, exchange gossip, or argue about whether East's sawmills cut straighter than West's cooperagers. A small plaque remains half-rusted, reading, "For when you don't know where you belong." A particularly quirky fact. In 1883, someone proposed that both bridges be permanently joined and fused with a rotating central gazebo, allowing simultaneous ceremonies and civic discussions. The idea was floated, diagrammed, and even blessed by one pastor. The prototype collapsed during testing, which, in true Saginaw fashion, only made the gazebo designer more determined. "We just need better screws," he insisted. He was never seen again after moving to Ohio. Scholars have long debated the bridge's symbolism. Some argue the split crossings reinforced Saginaw's fragmented identity. Others see them as stubborn monuments to autonomy, proof that neither side would give in, even when giving in meant getting across town faster. A few more romantic historians suggest the dual bridges gave lovers an excuse to linger mid-river, claiming flood delay while stealing a kiss between toll booths. You make your way to the old toll booth hut, now a storage shed for the historical society. Inside, among yellowed ledges and dusty oil lamps, you find an original tollmaster's log. The entries are priceless. 3 cents. Woman with duck cart, 7 cents. Man claiming to be the spirit of trade, denied 1 cent, returned to boy with harmonica, excessive playing. There's even a record from 1890 of a goat being charged double for bridging without supervision. Some say the bridges were eventually unified after a particularly cold winter froze the river so thoroughly that people just walked across wherever they liked. The towns, faced with a public that ignored their bridges entirely, finally agreed to synchronize opening schedules, but even that took 6 months, and only happened after someone slipped on ice and sued both municipalities at once. The settlement included a clause requiring bridge staff to maintain courteous neutrality, unless provoked. Today, the bridges stand mostly unchanged. No more tolls, no more dual operators. But locals still refer to them by their old names: East Pride and West Stretch. Tour guides claim if you stand between the drawspans at twilight, you can hear faint echoes of arguing tollmen shouting about correct rope coiling techniques and bridge etiquette violations. It's probably just wind. As you cross to the far side, a young couple walks past, one whispering, "I like this bridge better." The other replies, "Only because it's closer to the bakery." You smile. Even now, the debate now more playful, but still part of the town's DNA. And maybe that's what bridges really are. Not perfect connections, but platforms where we negotiate difference, where we meet halfway, awkwardly, repeatedly, and keep trying across fog, tolls, and onions. Newspapers. Nonsense. And the duel of the dueling editors. The morning air carries a faint rustle as if a million pages just turned all at once. Round the corner past a general store and a hat shop where no one's bought a bowler since Roosevelt, and find yourself face to face with 2 proud facades, one painted a sun-faded navy blue and the other a resolute brick red. The signs above them, carved in wood and bold lettering, read, East Saginaw Clarion and Saginaw City Weekly Trumpet. You've arrived at the twin titans of print, 2 editorial fortresses that, for nearly half a century, turned local journalism into a contact sport. Step inside either newsroom and you'd smell ink, sweat, and the particular ambition that only rises from men who think semicolons are weapons. The Clarion was known for its poetic headlines, deep dives, and aggressively long sentence structures. Their lead journalist, Percival Thatch, once described a steamboat delay as a heinous maritime ballet of disjointed commerce and soggy regret. His mustache alone deserved a Pulitzer. Over at the Trumpet, things were simpler, snappier, and louder. Their editor-in-chief, Mabel Boom Boom Trenholm, believed punctuation was for cowards and truth should be shouted directly into the faces of the unconvinced. She once ran a 4-column front page with just the word lies, in bold, followed by a smaller subheading, more on page 2, also lies. The rivalry was legendary. At the heart of it was the 1871 lumberyard fire that wasn't, in which the Clarion reported that smoke near the river was evidence of an East Side arsonist with a personal vendetta against local shingles. The Trumpet fired back with an expose titled "The Only Thing Burning Is Your Sources." They included a sketch of a man holding a smoldering sandwich, which they claimed was the true cause. Circulation numbers exploded, so did tempers. For weeks the papers engaged in what historians now call the editorial cannonade. Daily op-eds took increasingly personal turns. The Clarion accused the Trumpet of being printed on inferior pulp, while the Trumpet questioned whether Clarion staff could read without monocles or inherited smugness. Cartoons mocked each other's presses. At one point, both newspapers published simultaneous apologies, each claiming moral victory while suggesting the other had tried. Bless their hearts. The community, naturally, was delighted. Merchants offered discounts based on which paper you quoted at checkout. Local teenagers formed Team Trumpet and Clarion Crew debate clubs. An enterprising blacksmith even made commemorative mugs with the quote, "I get my facts from both, my opinions from neither." And then came the duel. Not with pistols, thank goodness, This was a journalistic doula challenge issued by Clarion's junior editor, Elias Graft, to Trumpet's upstart columnist, Dora Wicks, after she referred to one of his pieces as an eloquent yawn. Graft, who had recently begun wearing elbow patches without irony, demanded satisfaction. The terms each would write a 500-word editorial on the topic of the true future of Saginaw. The winner would be decided by public vote at the town hall. The town's schoolmom was selected. To moderate, the church bell would ring when time was up. Dora Wicks' piece, sharp and full of one-sentence paragraphs, envisioned a unified Saginaw powered by steam and good sense. Graft's replied in metaphorical, and citing three philosophers, a future where ink and honor would bind both towns into literary greatness. In the end, the town voted for the pie served after the debate. A draw was declared, followed by applause and requests for a sequel. You wander into the Trumpet building, now a historical exhibit. One room showcases original presses blocks, and a framed copy of their most infamous typo, "Mayor proclaims cats will be taxed," which sparked 3 hours of public chaos until corrected. Nearby, a sound recording of a staged reading plays. You hear clarion tones and trumpet blares. Someone thought it would be clever. Across the river and the Clarion's old headquarters, a solemn corner displays the final joint edition printed in 1898, titled simply, "Saginaw Says Enough." In it, both sides agreed to unify their newsrooms, partially due to rising paper costs, partially because readers had started getting news from traveling vaudeville troupes. Historians still argue over who won the war of words. The Clarion camp praises elegance, depth, and moral outrage. The Trumpet loyalists favor brevity, humor, and boldface print. Fringe scholars argue that both papers were secretly owned by the same investor trying to sell more advertisements for liniment and ladies. Umbrellas. One rare copy of the Clarion once contained an accidental Trumpet insert, a misprint so legendary that collectors call it the Trumplarion, and a replica hangs under glass here, preserved forever like some bilingual holy text. Before you leave, you pass a wooden bench in the park between the two buildings. Carved into the backrest is the phrase, "Truth may vary depending on your side of the river." And maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Not the accuracy, not even the prose, but the passion behind every comma, every shouted claim, every dramatic retraction. A town that once fought with ink and paper now smiles at its own footnotes. Trains, trolleys, and the tracks to know where the morning fog is just beginning to burn off as you find yourself meandering toward the old rail district, where steel tracks glint like forgotten scars beneath tufts of weeds. You're guided not by modern signage or any particular destination, but by the faint, ghostly sound of a train whistle. Impossible, really, given that the last engine left this part of town decades ago. Still, the air smells faintly of coal and oil, and the ground underfoot has that unmistakable, slightly metallic crunch of cinder here. In this cobblestone tangle of iron and ambition was once the proud transit core of not one but two rail systems, because, naturally, East Saginaw and Saginaw City couldn't agree on a shared train station. That would have been too easy, too obvious, too cooperative. Instead, the towns built separate depots, just 0.9 miles apart. One was East Saginaw's Union Passenger Terminal, a red brick triumph with a clock tower, ornamental archways, and a dedicated velvet waiting room chair for the mayor's mother. Across the river, Saginaw City constructed the municipal central railhouse, boxier and less grand, but with pragmatic features like punctual clocks and benches you could actually sit on without fear of upholstery complaints. Both depots claimed they were the heart of Saginaw Rail. At first, they served different lines. East's depot welcomed the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, while the West linked to the Michigan Central and the Detroit, Bay City and Alpena line. But as rail companies merged and tracks multiplied, the problem became clear. Passengers kept boarding. In the wrong town, luggage got separated. A businessman once spent 3 days stranded after confusing the two depots and refusing, on principle, to cross enemy ground. You wander past an old rail switch, the kind that used to click and groan with the weight of civic indecision. Legend says one night in 1876, both towns accidentally routed a freight train onto the same track from opposite directions. The result was a slow-motion confrontation where both conductors refused to yield. They met nose to nose in the middle of the Cass Bridge and sat there, sipping coffee and tossing coins, while pigeons built a nest between the engines. The standoff lasted 18 hours. No one. East Saginaw responded by launching the River Loop, trolley, an ambitious streetcar project with brass rails and hand-painted cars. It circled the downtown district, ran on time, weather permitting, and included a courting bench in the rear car that was allegedly monitored by two discreetly placed mirrors. Saginaw City retaliated by developing its own gridline, electric, coach-straight routes, no loops, no courting. The trolley systems had nearly identical fare prices, but entirely different ticket colors. Transferring from one to the other required you to step onto a designated neutral island, often just a plank over a puddle, while a fare inspector squinted at your stub to check for forgery. A child once got stuck there for an hour because both conductors insisted the other system should accept him. He reportedly grew up to be a streetcar mechanic. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the town's trolley rivalry helped or hurt transportation. Some argue it led to innovationist cars had early electric lighting, while West cars pioneered canvas rain flaps. Others say it led to inefficiency, delays, and at least 2 dramatic derailments caused by poor communication and excessive civic pride. One fringe theory suggests both towns built parallel transit as a metaphor, rail lines representing the journey toward unity, though the scholars proposing this may have spent too much time near open bottles of ink. You step into the abandoned switching station, now a small exhibit space. A dusty map hangs on the wall, showing overlapping train routes like the doodles of 2 competing children. A caption reads, "Saginaw Rail Planning, 1882, subject to change without notice." Below it, a display case features a ticket punch, shaped like a swan, allegedly used on East's Valentine's Day trolley. The accompanying story claims a conductor once proposed marriage using a string of punched transfers. His fiancée said yes. Her parents objected. They were from West Saginaw. Another exhibit shows a bizarre invention, the commuter negotiation box, a small device placed at intersections where both trolley systems met. If cars arrived simultaneously, passengers were supposed to vote by pressing a button. The winning car would pass first, the losing car would wait. Naturally, both towns accused the other of button tampering. Eventually, the box was repurposed as a donation receptacle and filled weekly with buttons of every kind except the intended kind. Eventually, both systems began to fail, not because of each other, but because automobiles arrived. Gasoline didn't care what town you were from. Roads paved themselves across old loyalties, and suddenly, the train whistles stopped. Today, the remnants are mostly for show: decorative rail fragments, gift-shop paperweights shaped like cabooses, and interpretive plaques that try to explain how 2 towns so alike could make something as simple as transportation feel like a chess match in a moving carriage. You exit the museum and spot a stretch of still-functioning track, just one lonely rail running parallel to the sidewalk. Local tradition says if you walk it with 1 foot on either side, switching with each step, you'll have balance and clarity for the rest of the day. You try it. It's harder than it looks, but for a moment it feels like you're walking a line between what was and what might have been. Because in Saginaw, the trains didn't just move people, they moved allegiances. And even when those allegiances ran out of steam, the tracks stayed behind, just in case anyone forgot which way they used to travel. Schools, Solabi, and the great geography textbook fiasco. You walk now through a quieter part of town, if such a thing exists in the fractured saga of Saginaw. Tree-lined streets curve around aging buildings that once echoed with chalk dust, school bells, and children either reciting multiplication tables or hurling ink-soaked paper wads at each other. Welcome to the old academic quarter, where the schoolhouses East Saginaw's Jefferson Academy of Civics and Commerce and West Saginaw's Franklin Grammar Institute for Moral Industry once competed not just in spelling bees, but in philosophy, fashion, and even geography. And no, that's not an exaggeration. They once fought over where continents belonged. It's early afternoon, and the bell tower of Jefferson, now more decorative than functional, casts a long shadow across the lawn. You can almost hear the clanging bell that once signaled not just the start of class, but the beginning of ideological warfare in corduroy and wool. Inside the old building, now a modest museum, the desks are still arranged in rows, each with an inkwell, a slanted writing surface, and a plaque describing which mayor or merchant once studied there. A faint smell of yellowed paper and long-extinct perfumes lingers, as if ambition still clings to the rafters. Jefferson Academy, the pride of East Saginaw, championed a progressive curriculum. They emphasized economics, public speaking, Latin, poetry, and something called municipal ethics, a course designed to train future city officials how to disagree politely. Over in Saginaw City, the Franklin Institute prided itself on discipline, logic, hard science, and the stern memorization of moral lessons, one of which involved a fable about a boy who borrowed a plow and returned it unsharpened. The moral: sloth rusts virtue. The tension began when both schools adopted new geography textbooks in 1879, but Jefferson chose E.M. McFarland's Continental Compendium, while Franklin selected W.P. Durham's Modern Atlas of Trade and Empire. At first glance, both seemed standard maps, population figures, river systems, but by page 14, differences emerged. McFarland's compendium listed the Cass River as a vital artery of eastern Michigan commerce, while Durham's atlas, when claimed it was a minor tributary of limited navigability. East students, encouraged to see their town as a blossoming hub of trade, were soon clashing with West students who'd been taught it was a backwater. Things escalated quickly. During a citywide academic meet, a geography round turned into open bickering when a Jefferson student, asked to locate the Great Lakes, added, and East Saginaw, situated on prime timber routes, shall soon rival Chicago. A Franklin student shot back, "That's not geography, that's propaganda." The debate ended when a judge ruled both schools correct, and neither satisfied. Parents sent letters. Boards of education met. Someone suggested a cartographer duel. Meanwhile, the students waged a quieter war. Franklin pupils began editing McFarland textbooks by hand, scribbling inaccurate over certain pages and underlining Cass River entries with question marks. In response, Jefferson students started slipping folded pages from Durham's atlas into library books with sarcastic footnotes like, "As if Saginaw City knows what a trade route is." By 1881, the matter reached the town's newspapers. The Clarion ran a 4-part series titled Map Wars, How Our Children Are Learning Lies. While the Trumpet countered with East's geography as an emotional fantasy, editorials featured quotes from confused students, flustered teachers, and one cartographer who simply said, "It's a river. It flows." A particularly colorful incident involved both schools organizing separate regional geography day parades. Jefferson's parade featured a paper-match steamboat, a marching band in sailor costumes, and banners declaring "East is least, no more." Franklin's response was a walking tableau of trade goods carried in wagons, including a barrel labeled "Moral Industry 100% West Sourced." The two processions accidentally collided near the post office, resulting in a chaotic standoff involving flying at laces, a toppled butter churn, and a clarinet solo that was never heard to completion. To this day, scholars debate the root of the conflict. Was it civic pride, misguided pedagogy, or just the peculiar joy children take in being told their river is important and that the other town's isn't? One fringe theory posits that the textbook publishers themselves, McFarland and Durham, were distant cousins locked in a decades-old feud over a will. There is zero evidence for this, but the story remains popular among Saginaw's historical reenactors who perform a dramatized map trial every spring in the local amphitheater. Spoiler alert, the jury always splits. You duck into a restored classroom in the Franklin Institute, where the chalkboard still bears an old half-erased diagram of the Michigan watershed. Next to it, a motivational poster reads, "Truth is in the coordinates." On one desk sits an actual globe from 1880, cracked and some faded. Saginaw is labeled in large type, but only East Saginaw is underlined. Whether that was factory design or local modification, no one agrees. A display board near the back summarizes the aftermath. In 1885, both schools agreed to adopt the same atlas, a compromise edition called Unified Geography for the Modern Mind. It was printed locally and featured dual entries for all shared locations. The Cass River was described as both vital and modest. Detroit was called a city of ambition, reachable via either Saginaw. But even this did not end the rivalry. When the schools merged decades later, older alumni from both institutions still refused to agree on certain facts. In 1923, a retired Jefferson teacher was ejected from a trivia night for insisting Lake Huron should emotionally belong to East Saginaw. And in 1941, a former Franklin principal publicly stated during a retirement speech, "If there is such a thing as bias in a map, I say lean west." Today, schoolchildren in Saginaw learn from state-approved digital curriculums that include regional history modules. The modules are carefully balanced. Neither town is labeled superior. But deep down, in the dusty corners of memory, people still know. If you ask an elderly Saginaw native where the river really begins, they might just raise an eyebrow and say, "Depends who's asking." You exit the schoolhouse and pass a statue dedicated to the pursuit of learning. It features two students holding a globe together. Although local legend insists their hands were originally pointing in different directions, because in Saginaw, even education wasn't just about knowledge, it was about perspective. And in the battle of classrooms, textbooks, and rivers, the real lesson wasn't geography. It was identity drawn in chalk, revised in ink, and deeply etched into the town's restless, divided heart. Law, order, and the case of the two courthouses. You stroll now into the civic center of historical Saginaw, where the pillars grow thicker, the walls grow heavier, and the very air smells faintly of paperwork and powdery justice. It's an area where decisions were carved into marble. Names were inked into records and arguments echoed long after the gavel dropped. And like everything else in this delightfully complicated town, the law came with a twist. 2 towns, 2 courthouses, and far too many judges for the number of actual crimes. On your left stands the former Saginaw City Justice Hall, squat and serious with chipped limestone columns and a plaque that reads, "Equity through diligence." And just across the river, visible if you squint past the maple trees, is the more ornamental East Saginaw Courthouse, a proud domed structure topped with a copper weather vane shaped like Lady Liberty holding a pocket watch. It once rotated in the wind until it jammed during a trial about time theft. Both courthouses claimed jurisdiction over Greater Saginaw, though neither could agree where that jurisdiction started or stopped. For much of the late 1800s, that meant 2 separate legal systems, 2 sets of fines. And because this is Saginaw, 2 completely contradictory rulings on more than one occasion. Take, for example, the infamous goose dispute of 1874. A farmer's prized goose, Mildred, wandered across town lines and laid eggs in a neighbor's buggy in East Saginaw. The Saginaw City Court ruled it was trespass. East Saginaw ruled it was a divine sign of agricultural prosperity. Both courts issued competing rulings, and the goose was ultimately escorted to neutral territory under watch by 2 constables, each refusing to make eye contact. You step inside the old Justice Hall, now a legal heritage museum filled with dusty law books, crooked gables, and solemn oil portraits of men with strong jaws and even stronger opinions. A display case holds 2 identical lawman badges, one labeled East Marshal and the other City Sheriff. One had jurisdiction over bootleggers, the other over jaywalkers, or maybe it was the other way around. The records conflict. The rivalry extended beyond rulings into courtroom style. Saginaw City favored strict decorum, no talking out of turn, no hats indoors, and trials conducted with the solemnity of an opera. East Saginaw embraced theatrics. Lawyers gave florid speeches, waved handkerchiefs, and occasionally brought in character witnesses dressed in full costume. One East lawyer reportedly opened his defense by quoting Ovid, to which the city judge responded, "We try cases here, not literature." Naturally, this led to problems when cases spanned both towns. In 1882, a contract dispute between a timber merchant and a printer escalated into a jurisdictional crisis when both towns tried to host a trial simultaneously. East claimed the business deal was drafted on their soil. West claimed the contract was printed in their district. For 3 full days, the defendant was driven back and forth between courthouses like a ping-pong ball of jurisprudence. The verdict: mistrial. The lesson: use neutral ink, a quirky but well-documented fact. For a brief period in 1889, both towns had their own official court stenographer, but they were the same man. Elias Thimble, renowned for his speed and penmanship, took advantage of the situation by doubling his salary and toggling between courtrooms with 2 different wigs to avoid suspicion. His cover was blown when he accidentally submitted an East Saginaw transcript that included a Saginaw City judge's dramatic throat clearing. No charges were filed. Everyone was mildly impressed. Even the courthouse architecture reflected the divide. East's courtroom had stained glass windows with scenes from Roman law, high-backed velvet chairs, and a small indoor fountain that gurgled softly during sentencing. City's courtroom, in contrast, featured bare floors, open beams, and a large blackboard where judges could sketch visual arguments. It was later erased when a judge accidentally drew a duck mid. One of the most debated legal crises of the day was the mutual indictment agreement of 1876 after a particularly heated political season. Both courthouses issued indictments for the same person, a councilman, accused of bribing both towns' election boards. Rather than resolve the matter through communication, the courts began a public exchange of legal threats and, at one point, mailed each other official reprimands tied in red ribbon. These became so frequent that locals referred to the postal route as the Wrath Loop. It all ended when the councilman fled to Ohio and opened a pie shop. Modern legal scholars often cite Saginaw's dual courthouse era as a unique experiment in parallel litigation. Others call it a testament to the perils of civic duplicity, and a few suggest the entire system only lasted as long as it did because most residents couldn't afford to sue anyone anyway. You step out onto the courthouse lawn where justice once teetered in delicate balance. A statue stands here now too, judges facing away from each other, holding gavels pointed down. Its title, The Scales We Never Agreed Upon. Nearby, a faded bench bears the inscription, "Sit here if you've been tried by both." Beneath it, weeds curl gently around the legs like unresolved cases today. Of course, Saginaw has a single unified court system housed in a single building with air conditioning and a vending machine that only takes quarters from this decade. But deep in the town's DNA remains a quiet reverence for courtroom drama. Every once in a while, during a slow session, a judge might open with, "In the grand tradition of our twin benches," before ruling on whether a neighbor's rooster violated the noise ordinance. Because here, law and order weren't just about justice, they were about whose version of justice won. And in a town divided by a river, a bridge, and a goose named Mildred, the answer was never simple. Fire buckets, rival alarms, and the midnight water fight. You stroll now through a quieter corner of old Saginaw where the soot-blackened bricks still whisper about disasters that almost were. The town feels still, but your eyes catch the faint curve of a tarnished copper bell above a squat wooden tower. This used to be Station House No. 1, the East Saginaw Fire Company headquarters. Once home to the finest brass poles, longest hoses, and most elaborately waxed mustaches the 19th century ever produced. And just across the river, because of course, stood the Saginaw City Fire Brigade, equally equipped, equally proud, and equally unwilling to let East's flames be any of their business. You can almost smell the old mix of smoke, leather, coal oil, and scorched egos. Because in historical Saginaw, even fire was partisan, and fire didn't care where it burned. In the mid-1800s, both towns invested heavily in fire safety, not collaboratively, mind you, but competitively. East Saginaw bought an imported, horse-drawn steam pumper from Boston. It gleamed like polished brass armor and was dubbed the Sovereign. Not to be outdone, Saginaw City built a custom pumper locally, heavier, louder, and nicknamed the Juggernaut. Its unveiling included a parade and a spontaneous poetry contest about water pressure. The result, a town where house fires became civic showdowns. Each fire company responded only within its designated district, and while there were no official laws preventing cross-river assistance, the unspoken rule was clear: let them hose their own disasters. That led to awkward incidents where East Saginaw firemen stood by the riverbank, watching smoke rise on the other side, arms crossed, steam pumper gleaming, as West Side firefighters frantically bucketed water from the Cass. But the real turning point came with the midnight water fight of 1875. It began, as most things in Saginaw do, with a goat. Late one summer evening, a lantern in a West Side stable over by a goat in search of oats ignited a haystack. Flames leapt fast. Within minutes, the Saginaw City Brigade had hitched their horses and rumbled toward the blaze, trumpets blaring. But a curious thing happened. The wind shifted and sparks danced across the river. A row of lumber sheds on East's shoreline caught, then a tool barn, then part of the bakery. East Saginaw rang its bell, and the Sovereign barreled out hose at the ready. But when the two brigades met at the narrow Cass Street Bridge, both determined to douse the source, they clashed. Not fists, but streams. Yes, in what historians now refer to with baffled amusement as the aquatic altercation. The two fire companies turned their hoses on each other. Witnesses say the first stream hit a West fireman square in the chest, knocking him backward into a pile of sandbags. He responded in kind. Within moments, the bridge was a chaotic scene of arcing water, shouted insults, slipping boots, and flying buckets. The townspeople gathered, some cheering, some trying to help, most simply stunned. One woman reportedly yelled, "Save the goat," and fainted, despite the goat having already escaped to a nearby cabbage field. The fire eventually contained by volunteers with tin pails. Afterward, both towns denied responsibility for hose-based hostilities. A joint inquiry was proposed, then abandoned when each side insisted on appointing its own investigator. Instead, the newspapers had a field day. The Clarion ran the headline, "Sovereign-soaked scoundrels, heroic defense of East property." The Trumpet replied, "Juggernaut faces sabotage by imported stream tyrants." Editorial cartoons depicted firemen in boxing gloves, dueling with waterspouts. And yet, as ridiculous as it all sounds, something changed after that night. Not out of shame, oh no, but out of sheer exhaustion. In 1876, a shared fire council was proposed. Naturally, council couldn't agree on a name, a badge design, or whether to use East's ladders or West's buckets. But they did agree on one innovation: the two-tone bell code. From then on, fires ringing, 2 quick bells, and 1 long meant assist regardless of border. It wasn't peace, but it was an opening. A quirky historical footnote. East Saginaw firemen, for years after the incident, kept a small painted barrel in their station labeled "In case of West." It contained biscuits, coffee, and a truce flag made from an old apron. West Saginaw, not to be outdone, kept a framed photo of the sovereign on their breakroom wall, with the caption, "Looks fast, probably leaks." You step now into the old hose tower where coils of hand-stitched linen hose hang like retired pythons. A timeline on the wall lists every major fire from 1860 to 1900, and beside each is a column labeled Joint Response. The early entries are blank, but as the years go on, small check marks appear, then more, until by 1895, almost every incident was marked yes. There's still scholarly debate about whether the midnight water fight was a tragic misunderstanding or a deliberate act of municipal posturing. Some believe it was staged to prompt reform. One fringe theory suggests the goat was planted by city council operatives. That goat, incidentally, was later named Sparks and lived out its days on a pensioned farm, occasionally appearing in local parades wearing a red sash. Back outside, the old fire bell above the station tower shimmers in the late afternoon sun. If you listen closely, you swear you can hear a faint clanged echo of alarm, of pride, of 2 towns trying to decide whether they wanted to rescue each other or outshine each other. And maybe the answer, like most things in Saginaw, was both. Post offices, stamp feuds, and the great mailbox mix-up. You find yourself now walking a quieter route again, down a modest red brick lane that once pulsed with the great machinery of correspondence. There's something almost reverent about this place, the shuffle of envelopes, the creak of old hinges, the clack of inked stamps marking time 1 letter at a time. But don't be fooled by the humdrum image. This was Saginaw's next great battlefield, the post. To your left, the old East Saginaw postal hall sits dignified beneath an arched facade, windows like watchful eyes. Across the casse, in stoic symmetry, stands Saginaw City's Post and Telegraph Bureau, practically humming with bureaucratic resolve. If you're wondering whether one post office could have served the whole region, well, you haven't been paying attention. Yes, dear listener, in classic Saginaw fashion, the towns refused to share. Instead, they built twin post offices half a mile apart, each claiming to be the official federal branch. And the letters, they got caught in a storm of local politics, duplicated routes, and one of the strangest delivery schemes in American postal history. In 1871, when the United States Postmaster General attempted to assign a central postal code to the area, both East and West rejected the offer. East claimed it had more outgoing mail. West insisted it had more reliable mail. A compromise code SAG-1A was proposed. East Saginaw responded by issuing its own custom stamps. That's right, unofficial local stamps, depicting a portrait of their mayor astride a steamboat and labeled East Delivers. They even printed them on corn-based paper to symbolize growth. Meanwhile, West Saginaw began franking letters with wax seals and the phrase "In trust we post." The result, a logistical nightmare. Let's take a moment to appreciate the full absurdity. If a letter was dropped into a mailbox on East Water Street but addressed to a recipient on West Jefferson Avenue, it had to be restamped and reapproved across town before being delivered. If the recipient refused to pay the intertown handling fee, typically 2 cents or 1 cinnamon stick for barter, it was returned, with notes. 1873 alone, over 3,000 letters were rejected on the basis of incorrect side loyalty. One child's birthday card was returned unopened 6 times. The 7th time it was eaten by a goat named Sparks. Yes, that goat. The rivalry intensified with the introduction of the messenger brigade, a small army of teenage boys hired by both towns to hand-carry urgent documents. East Saginaw messengers wore green caps and delivered with a practiced bow. West Saginaws wore navy sashes and sprinted like newsboys in a Dickens novel. There were turf wars. One messenger duel reportedly involved a throng ledger, a minor sprained ankle, and an unsanctioned sandwich theft. You step inside the East Saginaw postal lobby, restored to its 1880s design, with original oak counters and a brass mail chute that once swallowed letters faster than municipal budgets could handle. A museum display tells of the great stamp confiscation of 1879, when federal inspectors raided East's stamp printing press and declared it an unauthorized local currency. East Saginaw's mayor famously retorted, "They're not currency, they're culture." The case went to court. The judge who owned a full set of the controversial stamps recused himself. No verdict was ever reached. Meanwhile, West Saginaw responded by creating the Postal Loyalty Club, where residents were issued wax tokens for every 10 letters successfully delivered within their district. The tokens could be redeemed for West-themed postcards, discount shoe shines, or, oddly enough, jars of pickled beets. Local legend says one man mailed his own taxes just to qualify for the beet deal. One particularly charming anecdote, in 1885, a romantic misunderstanding led to a full-on postal comedy. A woman named Clara in East Saginaw sent a letter to her beau Gerald in West Saginaw, ending it with the phrase, "Forever yours if the river permits." Unfortunately, a meddling postal clerk at the East office scribbled a snarky side note on the envelope, "She's bluffing." When Gerald received it, he read the note as part of the message. A week passed. Clara sent a second letter asking why he hadn't replied. Gerald's answer, "I thought your love was conditional." They eventually married, but never trusted postmen again. There's a scholarly debate about whether this postal division hindered or enriched civic communication. Some historians claim it fostered creativity. Mail art flourished. Messages became elaborate envelopes adorned with symbols to bypass censorship. Others say it fractured families and made banking nearly impossible. A fringe theory posits that the two post offices were originally part of a secret postal experiment meant to test psychological tolerance for bureaucratic redundancy. This theory is supported by precisely zero evidence but remains a favorite among bored grad students. As you exit the lobby and approach the old mail wagon outside, rusty elegant, fitted with curved roof and two lantern hooks, you spot an inscription on its side, "Neither rain nor sleet, nor civic bickering." The paint has worn off the rest. Today, of course, Saginaw has one central postal office. It works just fine, give or take the usual gripes about lines and missing packages. But if you ask an old-timer which postbox they trust, you might still hear East for news, West for love letters. Some things never fade, and maybe that's the truth of it. Every letter, every stamp, every small gesture of ink and paper was just one more thread in the frayed but enduring tapestry of a town, divided but never unread.